Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Murmurs, where dreams melt into shadows and stories float through your sleep. Videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying tonight's tale, The Lake That Remembers. Let's begin. They said the lake had no name, or perhaps it had forgotten it, just as it had forgotten the people who had once lived around its shores, their cabins now sunken into moss and silence. And the only road that led to it was little more than a suggestion on a torn map Elliot had found inside a rusted tin box buried beneath the floorboards of his grandfather's attic, along with a water-stained photo of a boy standing by the lake's edge, eyes scratched out with something sharp, something desperate, and on the back of the photo in a trembling hand were the words, "The lake remembers what we forget." He didn't know why he came, not truly, except that something inside him felt drawn to it, like a whisper through his dreams, calling him back to a place he had never been. And after weeks of sleepless nights and days haunted by that photo, he finally packed a small bag, left a note for no one in particular, and drove north without telling anyone where he was going, guided only by the fragments of an old memory that didn't feel like his own. And when he reached the edge of the forest that wrapped around the lake like a secret, he left the car and walked, crunching over dead leaves and breathing air that smelled faintly of rain and something older, like wood and time and loss. The lake revealed itself slowly, not all at once, as though reluctant to be seen, hidden behind a veil of mist that clung low to the ground, curling between trees and clinging to his clothes like fingers that didn't want to let go. And when he finally stepped through the last of the trees and stood at the water's edge, it was silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no breeze, just the soft lapping of water against forgotten shore, and a ripple that moved without cause across the dark surface, vanishing before it reached him, like something had slipped beneath just before he arrived. He saw the outline of a small dock jutting out from the bank, warped and grayed with age, its posts leaning as though exhausted by years of holding nothing but air. And beyond that, further down the shoreline, a cabin half swallowed by vines and time, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar, as if waiting for him, as if it had always been waiting for him. And though every part of his body told him to turn back, to walk away, to forget the lake and the photograph and the boy with no eyes, he moved forward, drawn not by curiosity, but by something deeper, recognition, maybe, or guilt. The inside of the cabin smelled like rot and dust, the kind of scent that wraps around your bones and lingers in your lungs long after you've left. And he stepped carefully across the creaking floorboards, each step releasing a groan, like the house was remembering pain, and he ran his fingers along the walls, where old photos still hung, faces faded, smiles blurred, except one, hanging crooked above the fireplace, a photo of the same boy from the attic, same clothes, same posture, same scratched out eyes, and he felt cold spread across his back as he stepped closer. Saw that beneath the frame, etched into the wood of the wall, were more words. "You saw what you shouldn't have." Elliot didn't remember seeing anything, but the moment he read those words, a sound echoed in the back of his skull. A splash, faint and distant, as though heard through water, followed by the soft drag of something wet moving across wood. And he turned slowly, every hair on his body rising, but the cabin was empty, just shadows and stillness. And yet the sound didn't stop. the dragging growing closer, softer, like someone crawling, like someone who had forgotten how to walk. And he stumbled back out into the daylight, breath catching in his throat as the mist outside had grown thicker, colder, wrapping around him like breath from a mouth too wide to see. He followed the path behind the cabin, unsure why, only knowing it felt like the right thing to do. And as he moved deeper into the trees, the mist grew quieter, more watchful, as though it was listening to his footsteps, and the trees grew taller, thinner, their branches arching above like ribs. And somewhere ahead, he saw it, an old rowboat, half submerged in the muddy bank, tethered to a post with a rope that looked more like braided hair than anything made by hand. And something about that rope made his stomach turn, made him stop in his tracks, but the boat gently rocked once, twice, then stilled, as though inviting him in. He didn't know why he stepped inside, only that he had to, that his feet moved before his mind could resist. And the moment he sat down, the boat began to drift, untethering itself from the post without help, without wind, gliding out across the dark water in absolute silence. And the lake beneath him seemed endless, black as ink, its surface reflecting nothing, not the sky, not the trees, not even his own face. And for a long time he floated, unsure if the boat was moving at all, until he saw it. An island, small, perfectly round, rising from the center of the lake like a forgotten thought, and on it a single tree, dead and bare, its limbs reaching toward the sky like something drowning. The boat touched the bank with a soft thud, and he stepped out, shoes sinking into mud that felt too warm, like breath. And as he approached the tree, he saw it wasn't alone. There were stones around it, dozens of them, arranged in no pattern, each one carved with a name, some names scratched out, others only half visible, and one stone in the center bore no name, just a deep gouge through its middle. And when he reached out to touch it, the ground beneath his feet trembled ever so slightly, and he heard it again, that splash, closer now, and then a whisper so soft he wasn't sure it was real. Not in words, just a sound, like someone remembering how to cry. He turned around quickly, heart hammering, but the boat was gone. There was no shoreline, no trees, no sky, just the island and the water and the sound of something moving beneath it, circling, rising, and as the wind returned, it brought with it a voice, faint, childlike, echoing as though spoken through water and glass. You left me here. You said you'd come back. And Elliot, though he did not know the voice, felt something crack inside him, something old, something buried. And the lake, beneath the weight of his silence, whispered again, I remember you. Elliot stood frozen on the island, the tree above him groaning with the weight of windless branches. And the names on the stones around him seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking, as if some were appearing while others faded, and the water beyond the shore was no longer still, but gently rippling in wide circles, as if something unseen was breathing beneath the surface, something that had just begun to stir after years of sleep. And though he wanted to speak, to call out or even whisper, the words would not come, not because he was afraid, but because it felt wrong to break the silence of a place that had not heard a voice in years. The wind began to move around him in slow spirals, carrying with it the scent of something floral but spoiled, like wilted lilies left too long in stagnant water. And the voice returned, closer now, a soft whisper weaving through the mist that clung to his skin like breath. You said you would stay, but you ran. And the moment it touched his ears, Elliot saw something, just for a second, in the reflection of the lake. Not a person, but a shape, curled like a child sleeping beneath the surface, pale limbs wrapped around knees, hair floating like weeds, face hidden behind long strands of black. And as he blinked, the image disappeared, replaced again by the endless, inky water. He stepped back, but his foot struck something, and when he looked down, he saw another stone, half sunken into the dirt, its surface carved with shaky letters that had been almost erased by time, but still barely legible. And he read it slowly, the words like ice in his veins. Elliot, 1997 dash. And there was no end date, just the year he had been born. And suddenly the island no longer felt like a place he had discovered, but one that had always belonged to him, or worse, one that had been waiting for him to come home. His breath came shallow now, panic brushing the edge of his calm like frost at the edge of a window. And he turned toward where the boat had once been, but there was only water now, stretching endlessly in every direction, and the fog had thickened so much that even the sky had vanished, leaving him beneath a white, choking ceiling that pressed down like memory. And as he stood there, he felt it, something beneath the ground, shifting slowly, as though the island itself were breathing with him, inhaling when he did, exhaling in perfect time. And the tree above him let out a long, low creak that sounded too much like a groan. He moved toward the shoreline again, hoping to find another path, another way off this island, but the edge was gone, the water now reaching the very base of the stones, rising slowly, patiently, and as it touched the stone with his name, it hissed, not loud, but sharp, like steam from an unseen pipe. And he stepped back, heart racing now, feeling more like a trespasser with every passing second. But still the voice came, soft as ever. I waited for you, even when they told me you weren't real. He didn't remember making any promises, didn't know who the voice belonged to, but he began to remember dreams from childhood, fleeting visions of a lake, of a hand reaching from dark water, of a girl's voice calling to him through the fog, and his mother's voice waking him up sharply, always frightened, always saying, "Don't go near the lake, Elliot." Not ever. And at the time he had thought it strange, because there had been no lake near their home, not for miles. But now he wondered if she had been trying to protect him from something he had already forgotten. Something that lived not in the world, but in the cracks between dreams and memory. The mist parted slightly ahead of him, revealing something he hadn't noticed before. A narrow path of stones leading out into the lake, vanishing into the fog. And though he didn't trust it, he followed it, step by cautious step, feeling each stone shift slightly under his weight, the water lapping just beneath his boots. And with every step, the air grew colder, until his breath fogged in front of him, and the voice returned, now closer, warmer. You used to sing to me, remember? When it rained, you said you would stay until the sky was quiet again. He stopped walking, overcome by a sudden dizziness. And when he looked into the water beside him, he didn't see his reflection anymore. Instead, he saw the girl from the photograph again, or something that had once been her, pale and swollen, eyes open but wrong, too wide and too dark, and her mouth moved beneath the surface, forming words he couldn't hear, but somehow knew. And as her hand reached upward, fingers just breaking the surface, he stumbled back, nearly slipping, catching himself only at the last second, heart pounding in his ears. The fog broke suddenly, and ahead of him stood a small structure, an old boathouse half submerged, its roof sagging inward, its door hanging open like a mouth mid-scream, and he knew, without understanding why, that he had to go inside, that the answers waited there. And the moment he stepped through the doorway, the world shifted again. The smell of rot replaced by something older. The sound of water replaced by a child's hum, soft and broken, echoing off the warped wooden walls. And the inside of the boathouse was filled with toys. Old, water-damaged dolls, wooden blocks, a rusted tricycle half buried in mud, and pinned to the far wall, a drawing in faded crayon. It showed a lake, a tree, a boy and a girl. And in the bottom corner, in trembling letters, me and Elliot, forever friends. Don't forget me this time. And something inside him cracked open. He remembered. He remembered a summer when he was very small, a cabin, a girl named Miriam who lived nearby, a game they used to play by the lake, a promise he had made, and a storm that came suddenly, lightning tearing the sky. And he remembered running, screaming for help, and slipping. And then nothing, only waking up in a hospital days later, and his mother's face pale with fear, and how she never spoke of that summer again, how they moved away soon after, and how he had forgotten, because forgetting had been easier than facing the guilt. But the lake hadn't forgotten, and neither had she. And now he was back, and the lake, like Miriam, was remembering everything. Elliot stood frozen in the boathouse, the faint hum of the child's song still echoing in the wooden beams above him, wrapping around his breath like fog. And in his hand, he still held the drawing, its paper soft with age, edges curling like old leaves. And as he stared at the crayon figures, something deep in his chest ached. Not fear exactly, but a grief that had no clear source, like mourning someone you once loved but no longer remembered. And behind him, the door creaked softly, though no wind passed through, as if the house was breathing with him, or watching, or both. The toys on the shelves seemed placed with intention, facing inward toward the drawing, their cracked porcelain faces all turned slightly downward, as if in mourning or reverence. And on one of the shelves, beneath a layer of dust and damp, he saw a small wooden box with initials carved into the lid, MC. And when he opened it, the inside was lined with velvet, now moldy and damp, and resting inside was a locket, silver but tarnished. And when he flipped it open, there were two tiny photos, one of himself as a child, maybe 5 years old, and beside it, the same girl from the lakeside photograph, smiling with her head tilted like she knew a secret, and in tiny writing beneath her photo, "My best friend, always." The air shifted then, not violently, but enough to feel like a change in pressure, like the world had leaned slightly to one side, and he heard footsteps above him, light, hesitant, padding across a space that should not exist because the boathouse had no upper floor, but the sound continued step by step until it stopped right above his head, and for a moment all was still, and then came the creak, long and slow, as though someone were kneeling, and a whisper so faint it might have been imagined. "Do you remember what you promised me, Elliot?" He stepped back, heart now steady but heavy, and walked out of the boathouse slowly, leaving the drawing where it had been, the locket clenched in his fist. And outside the fog had thickened again, wrapping the lake in a cocoon of silence, and the path of stones he had crossed was now completely submerged. The water risen so subtly he hadn't noticed until it was gone, and he turned in a slow circle, searching for another way. But the island was now an endless loop of mist, the landmarks shifting when he tried to focus on them. And behind him, the boathouse was gone too, replaced by dense trees that hadn't been there moments before. The forest on the island had grown, or perhaps it had always been there, hiding just beyond his vision. And now it stood before him, dark and waiting, the trees tall and narrow, their bark blackened with moisture, and a faint sound came from within. Not footsteps, not wind, but a low, rhythmic splash, like someone wading slowly through shallow water. And though fear crept up his spine, his feet moved on their own, guiding him into the trees, where the light dimmed further and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of wet soil and something faintly sweet, like decay hidden beneath flowers. The deeper he walked, the more the world behind him vanished, swallowed by trees that pressed closer with every step. And just when he thought he might be walking in circles, he came upon a clearing, circular and unnaturally quiet. And in its center was a pond, blacker than the lake, its surface perfectly still, as if untouched by wind or time. And as he approached, he saw that it wasn't water at all, but something thicker, almost like glass, yet rippling faintly beneath his reflection. And in that reflection, he wasn't alone. She stood beside him, Miriam, but not as she had been in the photo, and not as she had been beneath the lake, but something in between, her eyes wide and calm, her face pale but peaceful. And she reached out a hand toward his reflection, fingers not quite touching, and her voice came not from the air, but from the stillness itself. You left, but I never did. They told me you'd forget, but I always remembered. He reached out, fingertips brushing the surface, and the illusion shattered, the reflection rippling violently, breaking into hundreds of pieces like cracked glass. And he was thrown back from the edge, landing in the damp moss with a soft thud. Heart pounding, breath shallow, and the silence was broken by something new, a sound like breathing, not his own, not human, low and deep and ancient. And from the far edge of the clearing, a shape moved. It was not Miriam, it was something older, a shape of shadow, long-limbed and faceless, with arms that hung too low and a body that swayed as though underwater. And as it approached the pond, it didn't step around it, it walked across it, each footstep sending out soft ripples that shimmered with lightless reflection. And Elliot crawled backward slowly, every instinct telling him not to run, not to move too fast. Because whatever this thing was, it saw not just movement, but memory, and it paused halfway across the pond, lifting its head slowly, though it had no eyes, and in a voice that was many voices layered on top of one another, it said, "You came back to remember, but some memories remember you too." He stood shakily, the locket still in his hand, and raised it, not knowing why. And when a creature saw it, it recoiled, not in pain, but in recognition. And the voice that followed wasn't the creature's, but Miriam's again, clear and small. "It's the only part of me that stayed. You kept me safe, even when you didn't know it. Don't be afraid, Elliot. It's not here to take you. It's here to remind you what happens when we break promises to the dead." The figure stepped backward into the pond, sinking slowly without resistance, and the clearing grew colder, the trees whispering now in a language he didn't know but understood somehow. And the moment the creature vanished beneath the dark water, the forest shivered, and the path reappeared. A trail of moss-covered stones, leading back through the trees, straight toward the shoreline, and beyond the mist, he could see it now, dim but visible, the outline of a dock and a boat, waiting. Elliot stepped carefully onto the mossy stones, his breath quiet, the locket clutched in his fists like an anchor to a world that felt farther away with every passing moment. And as he walked the path through the whispering trees, the air around him changed again, not with temperature, but with time, like the forest was folding inward, dragging pieces of his past closer, bending memory into reality. And though the fog still lingered at the edges of his vision, the way forward felt clear now, almost too clear, like it was being offered to him rather than discovered. Each step echoed slightly beneath his feet, not like stone on earth, but like footsteps inside a hall long abandoned. And when he emerged from the tree line, the island looked different than before. Brighter, yes, but with a strange emptiness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And down by the shore, the boat waited just as he'd seen it, rocking gently in water that no longer seemed like water at all, but more like a mirror, thin, fragile, almost too still. And behind him, the trees stood silent, no longer whispering, but watching, like witnesses to a ritual they could not stop. He stepped into the boat slowly, the wood creaking softly beneath him, and sat down with the locket resting in his open palm. And the moment he touched the oars, the fog moved again, pulling away like curtains being drawn back, revealing the lake's center, wide and empty, save for a single unmoving shape, a dock, unfamiliar yet deeply known, floating far out in the middle of the lake. And as he rowed toward it, the ripples behind him vanished instantly, like the water didn't remember his passage or refused to. And the farther he moved from the shore, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of the oars disappeared, and all that remained was breath and heartbeat and memory. The dock grew larger with each stroke, and as he neared it, he saw that it was not made of wood, but of books, hundreds of books, waterlogged and swollen, stacked and nailed and pressed into form, and every book had a title etched not in ink, but in scratches. Deep grooves that spelled names he somehow recognized, names of children, names of neighbors, names of people who had once lived near the lake, and then hadn't. He tied the boat to a hook carved into the books and stepped onto the dock, which groaned under his weight, but held, and in the center of the dock was a single chair, and on the chair was a girl, Miriam, exactly as she'd looked in the photo. Same blue dress, same tilted head, but her skin was gray-blue now, and her eyes, though open, did not blink, and she did not move or breathe or speak. And yet, he felt her presence like warmth in his chest, like the feeling you get before you remember something important but painful. And when he stepped closer, her lips parted just slightly, and a voice, not from her mouth but from the air around her, spoke in his own voice but younger, full of promise and fear and innocence. "I'll come back. I promise. I'll never leave you here." He fell to his knees, the memory crashing into him, not like a vision, but like drowning, and he remembered it now. Summer, laughter, a game near the water, and her hand slipping from his, and the scream that never came, and the adults who searched but never found, and the way they told him she must have wandered into the woods or the lake, and how he'd stood there night after night, waiting at the edge of the water, hoping she'd call out to him, but she never did, and eventually they moved away, and the lake became a story, and the story became a shadow, and the shadow became forgotten. Until now. She turned her head slowly toward him, the movement smooth and soundless, and her voice this time came from her lips, soft and cracked and full of sleep. You remembered me. That's all I ever wanted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, the silver cold against his palm, and without knowing why, he opened it and placed it on the chair beside her. And when he did, the water beneath the dock rippled for the first time since he'd arrived, and the books began to whisper, soft, fluttering sounds like pages turning in a windless room, voices rising in waves, not of fear, but of release, names being spoken one by unseen lips. And the dock began to sink, not fast, but steadily, the books dissolving into the water like sugar, and Miriam's body with them, her smile lingering longer than her face, until the chair was empty and the dock was half gone. He stepped backward into the boat, trembling not from fear but from something older, like the grief of waking from a dream you didn't want to leave, and untied the rope just as the last of the dock vanished beneath the lake, and this time he didn't row. The boat moved on its own, gliding gently back toward the shore, the fog parting for it, the sky above beginning to change, not clearing, but shifting to a deeper gray, like dusk had arrived early. And on the far bank, he saw the cabin again, and the path beyond it, and somehow he knew he could leave now, that whatever had been waiting here no longer was. When he stepped back onto the land, the world felt quieter, lighter, the air no longer pressed against his lungs, and the whispers in the trees had become bird song, soft and aimless, and the lake behind him was still and silent, its surface no longer reflective, but dark and empty, like any ordinary lake might be. But he knew, it remembered, and so did he. The forest no longer whispered his name, nor did it try to turn him around or mislead his steps. And as Elliot moved through the trees with the faint sound of water behind him, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not fear, not peace, but a silence he hadn't known since childhood. A silence that carried weight, like a memory finally laid to rest. And though he still didn't understand all of what had happened, he knew something had been completed, a circle closed, a promise remembered. He returned to the cabin slowly, his boots brushing through damp leaves and soft soil, and the place that once felt foreign now seemed like a room he had dreamed of many times, but never entered. And as he stepped onto the porch, the boards no longer groaned underfoot. They accepted his return, and when he pushed the door open, the air inside was no longer stale or cold, but warm, like a fire had been lit long before he'd arrived and had waited for him to come home. Nothing had changed in the cabin, and yet everything had. The dust had settled, the shadows no longer reached for him, and the mirrors reflected only what was there, no longer distorted by time or memory. And on the table near the window, where once he saw a flickering vision of Miriam's smile, there now rested the locket, polished, dry, as if it had never been dropped into the lake. And when he picked it up, it felt light, not like metal, but like memory made gentle. He sat for a long time, not speaking, not thinking, just breathing, as outside the day moved forward with the lazy rhythm of clouds shifting over a gray sky. And in the stillness, he thought of her, not just Miriam, but the lake, the house, the whispers, all of it, as one living thing, ancient and aching, waiting for someone to remember. And now that it had been remembered, it could finally sleep again. But even as that peace settled over him, a part of him felt pulled towards something unfinished, not terrifying, but calling, like the last page of a book he hadn't turned. And without knowing why, he stood, walked to the fireplace and crouched low beside it, brushing ash and soot from the stones. And there, etched into the brick with a dull knife or broken nail, was a name he didn't recognize. Callie. Just that. No date, no message. Just a name scratched deep into the hearthstone, hidden in plain sight. And the moment he saw it, the cabin exhaled again. He turned sharply, eyes searching the corners of the room, but nothing moved, no shadow flinched, no whisper returned. Only the sound of wind stirring the trees outside. But something had shifted in the house just slightly, like one secret had given way to another, smaller but just as old. And as he stood, he realized the locket had opened in his hand on its own. And inside, beside the photo of Miriam, was a second picture now, faded, barely visible, a young girl with dark eyes and a quiet smile, standing in front of a different house, a different lake, perhaps, or maybe just another dream. He didn't remember her, but the lake did. He slipped the locket back into his pocket and stepped outside again, the air cooler now, the light beginning to dim in that soft, golden way it does just before the blue of evening takes over. And instead of walking away, he followed the edge of the trees, tracing the shoreline gently, listening for anything, any sign that someone, somewhere, might still be watching. And then he saw the second path, narrower than the one he had arrived on, hidden behind a low curtain of branches, winding away from the cabin into a denser part of the forest, where the trees grew older and closer, and the air felt thicker. Not with fear, but with memory. And though every instinct told him to turn back, to end the story here, he stepped forward, parting the branches gently, the trail crunching beneath his boots like old bones wrapped in moss. And with each step, the world grew quieter again, like entering the breath between dreams. The trees here whispered differently, not calling his name, but speaking to each other. And though he couldn't make out the words, he felt their meaning. He's come back. He's come back again. The path led to a clearing, circular and perfect, surrounded by stones arranged like a broken sundial. And in the center of the clearing was a chair, wooden, worn, familiar. And on that chair sat no one, but the impression of someone having just left remained in the shape of the cushion, the tilt of the back, the way the grass bent beneath its legs. Elliot approached slowly, breath steady, and when he reached the chair, he found something resting on it, another locket, this one rusted shut, and when he touched it, the clearing pulsed slightly, like the heart of the forest beat once, and then fell silent again. He didn't try to open the locket. He simply sat beside it and waited. And in that stillness, he began to understand. The lake was not haunted by ghosts in the way stories often claimed, but by echoes, fragments of memory so strong they shaped the land around them, built houses from grief and paths from guilt and trees from forgotten names. And his return, his remembering, had awakened not one story, but many, and they would all rise now, one by one, like dreams resurfacing from the depths of sleep. And maybe that was okay. Maybe not all stories needed endings. Some were meant to be remembered. Some were meant to drift just beneath the surface, waiting for the next voice, the next dreamer, the next lonely heart looking for something they left behind in a life they couldn't name. Elliot closed his eyes, and for the first time since he arrived, he didn't hear whispers. He heard breathing, the trees, the lake, the house, him, all dreaming together. The stillness of the clearing lingered even as night began to spread its quiet fingers through the trees, and Elliot, Seated beside the chair with the unopened locket resting like a question beside him, felt the air grow heavy, not with cold, but with a weight that had no temperature, no shape, just a quiet pressure, like being watched by a memory that hadn't decided yet whether to speak or stay hidden. The forest around him had stopped whispering, not out of peace, but as though it too were holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. And when he finally stood, brushing soil from his palms, he heard something faint, so faint he wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. A hum, low and childlike, drifting just beyond the trees like a lullaby sung through teeth. He followed it, not quickly. He moved as if in a dream where every step required effort, where time flowed sideways and shadows bent in directions they weren't supposed to, and the further he walked, the more the forest felt like it was rearranging itself, as if revealing a version of itself long buried, like pages of a book that had been soaked and dried, and now peeled back with a soft tearing sound. And then he found the second house. It was small, almost a replica of the cabin, but older, sunken into the ground slightly, covered in moss and ivy and time, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges, as though it had been opened many times from the inside by hands that didn't quite remember how to leave. And above the door frame, barely visible, was a name carved deep into the wood, Callie, the name from the fireplace, the name from the forgotten part of the house. He hesitated. Something in him knew that entering this place would change things, would deepen the story in ways that couldn't be undone. But his hand still reached forward, still touched the door, still pushed it open with a long creak that sounded like a breath finally exhaled after years of silence. Inside, the house was wrong. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like someone had left in the middle of a moment and never returned to finish it. And on the table in the center of the room sat dozens of drawings, childlike, smudged with charcoal and colored pencil, pages yellowed and curling, each one showing the same thing from slightly different angles. The lake, the house, and a figure standing at the edge, always alone, always staring into the water. Elliot picked one up and turned it over. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was a sentence. "If I remember, will she let me go?" And then he heard the creak of a floorboard behind him. He turned, heart suddenly still in his chest, and saw nothing. But the air had changed, and so had the light. The room now slightly darker, though no window had been covered. And he felt for the first time that something was in the room with him, not watching, not whispering, but waiting. He moved deeper into the house, each room smaller than the last, until he reached a final door at the end of a narrow hallway. A door that looked newer than the rest, cleaner, as if it didn't belong here. And when he touched the knob, the locket in his pocket vibrated softly, as if warning him, as if reminding him that not all memories are safe to touch. He opened it anyway. The room was empty. But the moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, and the walls began to breathe, not move, not shake, but breathe, rising and falling like lungs around him. And the air grew thick with the scent of wet leaves and old paper. And from the far corner of the room, a voice rose, not loud, not cruel, just sad, endlessly sad. "You weren't supposed to forget." Elliot's mouth was dry, his body cold, and he turned slowly to face the corner. But there was no one there, only a mirror, old and warped, standing upright against the wall. And within it, he saw not his own reflection, but a child, dark-eyed, small, staring back at him with an expression not of fear, but recognition. Callie, and behind her, in the mirror, the lake. But it wasn't the lake he had seen before. It was darker, deeper, more alive, and from its center rose something vast and shapeless, made of smoke and memory. And Callie turned her head slowly toward it and whispered, "She remembers everything." Then the mirror shattered, and in that shattering, Elliot found himself back outside, the house behind him gone, the clearing empty, the chair vanished, the locket gone from his pocket, and in its place a stone, smooth and cold, with a symbol etched into it, a spiral surrounded by eyes. He was back by the original lake now, though he hadn't walked, though time hadn't passed, and the water was still, perfectly still, and in that silence, he understood. This lake didn't take people. It held them, trapped them in their own memories, their own guilt, until they remembered who they were to each other, until the forgotten names were spoken again, until grief had been seen and named and released. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he had come. Not just to remember Miriam, but to find the others too, the ones who were never spoken of, the ones who were too painful to keep in photographs. The lake had remembered him, and now he remembered Callie, and somewhere, maybe someone else would remember too. The water rippled, and a whisper not from the trees this time, but from within himself rose like breath. The surface of the lake was still as glass, holding not just reflections but something deeper, something older than mirrors and clearer than memory. And Elliot, standing at the edge with the stone clutched in his palm, felt like the water was breathing in rhythm with him, as if it had waited for this moment far longer than he had known. He no longer felt lost. He no longer felt afraid. But he did feel something he hadn't expected to. Sorrow, soft and weightless, like fog resting on skin, not heavy enough to crush, just enough to make everything quiet. And beneath that sorrow, a question, whispered not by the wind or the trees, but by something older. Are you ready to remember it all? He stepped into the water, not far, just enough for the cold to reach his knees, just enough to feel the lake accept him, as if it recognized his presence, as if it remembered the shape of his grief, and slowly the sky above began to darken. Not with night, but with memory, a spreading hush that turned the clouds to shadow and the light to something softer, and in that moment, the forest behind him vanished, and in its place a house appeared, but not the old cabin. This one was taller, whiter, not yet broken by time, and its windows glowed gently with the golden light of a memory long buried. And from within, Elliot could hear laughter, footsteps, music too faint to place, and his heart beat once, hard, because he remembered that house, not from this lifetime, but from the photographs, from the edge of dreams he used to forget the moment he woke. And from the porch, a girl stepped forward. She was older now, not the child from the mirror, not the name etched in the door, but the version of herself she had never been allowed to become. And her eyes were steady, deep, full of a sadness worn so long it had become her calm. And when she looked at him, Elliot felt like he had finally come home, not to a place, but to a moment, to a truth that had waited years in silence. "You left," she said, not angrily, not accusingly, just simply, the way someone might say it was raining outside or the tea had gone cold. He nodded. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice caught between breath and water, between apology and understanding. "No," she said gently, stepping down the porch toward the lake, the house behind her fading with every step. "You forgot." And the word landed in him like a key turning in a lock, And suddenly it all came back. The childhood summers, the lake house visits, the games they used to play in the shallows, the secret hiding spot beneath the old dock, the whispering stories before sleep, and the day it ended, the day she disappeared into the lake while he was supposed to be watching her, the day her name became too painful to speak aloud. Callie, his sister, not a ghost, not a myth, but a girl lost to time because the grief had been too heavy to carry into adulthood, because forgetting had been easier than remembering, because some pain turns itself into fog and stays that way unless you walk into it on purpose. He fell to his knees in the water. He didn't cry. He just breathed, just let the ache of it sit in his chest like a stone that no longer needed to be hidden. And Callie sat beside him, folding her legs as if they were children again, staring at the surface that still refused to ripple. "I didn't want to be angry," she said softly. "I just wanted someone to remember I was here." The lake shimmered around them, not with waves but with memory, and all at once the water began to glow faintly, lit from beneath, and dozens of faces rose just beneath the surface. Soft outlines, not haunting, just watching, gentle, waiting, the others who had been forgotten, the lost names and unspoken griefs of 100 people who had come to this lake and never been carried home. And now Elliot understood. The lake wasn't cursed, it was sacred, a place that held memory for those who couldn't, that offered shelter to sorrow too heavy to name. And in return, all it asked was this: remember them. One by one, the faces began to rise into the mist, dissolving like breath, like wishes, and with them he saw fragments of lives, a child's laugh, a mother's lullaby, a father's embrace, a grandmother's story whispered into the dark. And each time he saw one, he whispered a name, any name, just so they could be spoken again. He turned to Callie. "Can you go now?" he asked, his voice barely there. She smiled. "Only if you keep me," she said. And with that, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. And in that instant, he saw everything, not just her life, but his. Every shared moment, every forgotten glance, every echo of their story that had been pushed to the corners of silence. And as she pulled away, the light within the lake dimmed, the faces faded, and the air around him grew still once more. She was gone, not vanished, released. And Elliot, now alone in the water, no longer felt lost. He walked back to shore as dawn began to rise. Not sudden, just slowly, like the world itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling again. And when his feet touched the earth, the stone in his hand dissolved to sand, slipping between his fingers, leaving only warmth behind. Behind him, the lake shimmered once more, and then it was still, forever. He never told anyone what happened, not because he couldn't, but because the lake wasn't a story to be explained. It was a memory to be held, and every now and then, when the fog rolled in just right and the water looked like glass, he would return to its edge and sit and listen, not for voices, but for quiet, for the hush that meant someone had been remembered. And in that stillness, the lake would whisper back,